Good morning once more for those who are with us in Bible study. I did dress up. Try not to be jealous. This morning is actually the second of a series, hopefully a mini-series. We'll see how far we get today. It is for those who may be questioning whether or not God does exist, or those who really believe that God exists. Difficulties when having conversations with other people. Maybe they have told you something like, well, that's just your imaginary friend. And we as people with minds, we have brains, we can think. We can rationalize. We have an ability to think for ourselves. And so when we feel a little bit rocky, when we feel like maybe I'm not sure I know the answer to some of these questions, that's what I hope that you will be blessed with as we discuss this topic this morning. We are only going to cover a few of the evidences for God. Last time, we only did cover a couple of points. We spoke about the origin of the universe and how some of the leading scientists and even physicists have talked about the Big Bang and what caused the Big Bang. And when you try to find out from them and you ask them, well, what was before that? And I can give you quotes, and we did that last time. You can find that on YouTube, I believe. But their answer is, we don't know, or nothing. Well, when you look at the natural laws of science, which they are depending on, this is their own methodology, we have principles such as causality. For every material effect we see, there is a cause that came before it or at the same time and was greater than it. So something was caused by something. That's always the case in the natural world. So if the Big Bang came from something called a singularity, which was a subatomic particle where all the laws of nature supposedly broke down, the atheists admit this, then what caused that? And if there were no natural laws at that time, then the only logical conclusion that we could draw is that something supernatural would have caused it. We also have other laws of science, such as Newton's first law of motion, inertia. An object remains at rest and an object in motion remains in motion at constant speed and in a straight line unless acted on by an unbalanced force. So if something came from nothing but we see the universe is in motion, some outside force had to act upon it. And then we can talk about the laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy. You may have heard that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. This is within the natural physical world. And the second law of thermodynamics, known as entropy or the chaos law. It states that natural processes tend to go one way, toward less usable energy and to more disorder. It's just like when you have to maintain your car or your house. Things eventually degrade. So how did something as orderly as this earth and the universe come into play? How did that become into existence? And so we discussed a little bit about the origin of the universe. And we looked at Scripture that speaks to it. We looked at what the atheists have to say and how they say that something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the universe. It would have had to be something pretty mysterious indeed, but we do know that God is also mysterious. We also looked at the fact that design demands a designer. The fact that we see such complex ecosystems, that we see how the planets orbit the sun, how the moon orbits the earth, And you could go on and on and on. We even found that Einstein himself admitted that God reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists. Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." Hebrews 3, verse 4, "For every house is built by some man, but he that built all things is God." And so today we're going to start with the third of 6 points. Life demands a life giver, a supernatural life giver. These laws of science that we talk about, these are all natural material laws. And laws are things that there have been no observable exception for in the material world. Like the laws of motion and of thermodynamics, there is no recorded exception to any of those laws. That's why they are laws. So the only thing that could cause something like that would have to be beyond the natural laws, i.e. supernatural. But today we're going to look at a different law. We're going to look at biology for a moment this morning. Life demands a life giver. Have you ever heard of the law of biogenesis? Bio means life. I hope we all know what Genesis means. It means beginning. Life comes from previously existing life of its own kind in our natural material world. So, law of biogenesis means that life comes from life. We see that atheists have asserted and continue to assert non-biological origin of life. But remember, the law of biogenesis is a law. We've never observed even one exception to that in the material world. Let's take a look a little bit in his history. Francesco Redi. He was an Italian physicist. He was also a naturalist. He proved that life comes from life, not from non-living chemicals. I remember in high school, I had a high school biology class. I might have been a sophomore at the time. And he was quite an interesting character. He liked to ride motorbikes, had a big beard, and really kind of gruff around the edges. But after this experiment, I realized that he believed in God. And by teaching biology, it was part of his rationale for believing in God. And of course, in the education system, it's a very fine line what you can say to your students. But I was able to figure that out from him. Have you ever heard of putting meat in jars? Francesco Redi did this way back in the 1600s. And basically you put rotted meat in jars. You have one jar that's completely open, one jar with like a wire mesh on it, and then you've got another jar that's completely sealed. And at the time, people were thinking, well, life comes from non-life. They didn't know any better. So Francesco, he's out there, he's throwing some meat in jars. And sure enough, the jar that's open to the air, all of a sudden you start seeing maggots. And the jar that is sealed does not. Well, naturally you're thinking, yeah, it's obvious. Flies go land on the meat, they lay their eggs, and then these maggots develop. Francesco was the first one to do that. And even me, in biology class, replicated his 1600s experiment when I was in high school. But that, in effect, did disprove this concept called spontaneous generation. In other words, life from non-life. Life did not just spontaneously generate from inorganic material. And then you may have heard of another scientist, Louis Pasteur. He was a French chemist, pharmacist, among other things. He lived in the 1800s. He also disproved spontaneous generation. In fact, he took flasks, and he found that if he had a sterilized, sealed flask, nothing ever developed, no life ever developed. But if it was unsealed, if it was not sterilized, microorganisms could develop. He was also a microbiologist. He also discovered that boiled broth kills microorganisms. Louis Pasteur. Pasteur, pasteurize. You go to the store, you get pasteurized milk. That's where it came from. He was the one who discovered this. But he was able to disprove that and therefore prove this law of biogenesis. However, despite scientific methodology, atheists still assert spontaneous generation. And let me, before I go into any quotes or name any names or even say the word atheists again, let me preface, I'm not up here to attack any one person or group personally. We are rational beings. We have our own minds. We can think for ourselves. So what I am doing when I provide names and I provide quotes is that we are simply trying to assert the facts for ourselves and analyze the facts for ourselves. So this is not an attack on anybody. This is self-reflection. This is for us to think things through. So there's an individual, Alexander Graham Cairn Smith. He was an organic chemist and molecular biologist. And he worked at the University of Glasgow, Scotland. And he asserted that life could have come from clay. See, clay traps molecules and it can organize molecules into crystallized type of patterns, kind of like our genes and our genetics are now. And so the postulation that he made is that, well, after a while, these inorganic molecules sort of turned over into organic molecules. So you go from the inorganic to the organic. I'm a geologist. I know what clay can do. It can turn into rock, perhaps, over time, and different types of rock. But rocks aren't alive. And quite frankly, no one has actually been able to demonstrate a process within which clay, inorganic, turns into something organic. It's just an idea, just because clay can organize into crystallized patterns, so maybe it somehow relates to genetics. A recent idea came from the University College of London. They created these non-living structures called protocells that they got from deep sea vents. And so another hypothesis out there is that life originated from deep sea vents. Again, nothing has been demonstrated. The law of biogenesis has not been disproved. There's another individual, Jeffrey Botta. He's a marine chemistry researcher. He talked about ice. The idea is that key organic compounds are more stable and concentrated in ice, and so I guess ice could be the source of the origin of life, just because organic compounds tend to be more stable in ice. But it's not backed up by any evidence. There is no process that we can scientifically follow that demonstrates this happening. It's just another idea. And then another idea is this thing called panspermia, or all seed in the Greek. Svante Arrhenius, he was a Swedish scientist. He coined this term, and he actually coined it from studying history, Greek history, back to the 5th century BC. And he stated that life exists throughout the universe and was distributed by space dust, meteors, asteroids, comets, planets, spacecraft. I started thinking about Superman, how he came from Krypton, landed in that spacecraft on Earth. By the way, this has little support in mainstream science either, because it doesn't actually answer the question of the origin of life. He's just saying life came from somewhere else in the universe, but where did that come from? And quite frankly, this panspermia idea that we came here from some other planet or from an asteroid or a meteorite that crashed on the Earth, that we don't have evidence for that. It's just someone's thought. So it's unsupported by science. Another recent one that seems to have gained a lot of traction is something called RNA replication. So you've heard of DNA. You've got this double helix thing. RNA is typically a half helix. It's a molecule that's essential for most biological functions. It exists in all biological life. And you have this thing called messenger RNA, for example. It conveys genetic information. The genetic information is held by DNA, but it conveys that information and can direct synthesis of specific proteins. It's become widely accepted in science that early in the history of life on Earth, prior to the evolution of DNA, and possibly of even protein-based enzymes, that there was this world called the RNA world in which only RNA existed. And it's because of this thing called a ribozyme that you can find in RNA. A ribozyme just gives an RNA the ability to splice itself. And so they think that RNA somehow formed in the primordial soup. You've heard of primordial soup? It's like this mixture of water and gases that would have been guessed as the early beginning of the Earth. And so somehow you've got these gases and water mixed together, and then RNA just sort of comes out of that, and then somehow the DNA and comes along after that, along with these protein enzymes. Well, let's not get too far into the science on this. Let's take a big picture look at this. Take your body, for example. There are about 50 trillion cells in your body. Each one of these has 46 strands of DNA. Each strand of DNA is in the order somewhere about 6.6 feet long. Okay? So if you unwind all of your DNA in your entire body, place it end on end next to each other, you're looking at about 5 million round trips to the moon. And if you were to type it out in a book, you would fill the Grand Canyon over 40 times. And so think about this. If that's just DNA, and we've got somehow this hypothesis that there was a world where DNA did not exist, it was just the RNA, and somehow it turned into DNA when it spliced itself, and it somehow gathered and carried its own genetic information, which, by the way, RNA doesn't do, and RNA is in all forms of life. How did the DNA get there? Why, if DNA is that important, that substantial to our makeup, there's no explanation, truly. And again, it's not been demonstrated. Well, I hesitate to do this, but I want to talk to you a little bit about probabilities. There was a couple of individuals by the name of Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe. Hopefully I pronounced her name correctly. They stated that the probability of all the chemicals for life arising on their own by chance is 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Okay, let's talk about the powers of 10, for example, just to get your mind around this. If you have 10 to the power of 1, that's 10. 10 to the power of 2 is 10 times 10, which equals 100. 10 to the power of 3 is 10 times 10 times 10, which is 1,000. 1 million, 10 to the power of 6. 1 billion, 10 to the power of 9. And 1 trillion, 10 to the power of 12. 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. I don't even want to try to guess how to say that. Let's give you some perspective on the powers of 10. It is estimated that there and it varies a few exponents up and down, but they've estimated about 10 to the 80 atoms in the universe. That's just the number 80, not 40,000. 10 to the 80 atoms in the universe. 1 in 10 to the 67th power is the probability that amino acids formed proteins undirected. Okay, so we're going back to this RNA, DNA thing. You think about your car engine. Sometimes you might be able to substitute one part for another part, but there are certainly some parts that are very specialized for a certain thing, and other parts very specialized for another thing. And those of you who are mechanics out there will be able to give much better examples than I can. Think of RNA and DNA like that. They have very specific functions. So how did the car engine evolve on its own? Well, it didn't. Design demands a designer. Somebody built it. Anyway, 1 in 10 to the 67th is a probability that has been calculated that somehow this happened on its own. Let me give you one more power of 10. 1 in 10 to the 50th. This is a probability. 1 in 10 to the 50th. These two individuals came up with that number, and that spoke to the fact that there is a threshold that something will not practically happen at all. This calculation was made by French mathematician Émile Borel. And I'll quote from Émile Borel himself. It says, he stated, "The occurrence of any event where the chances are beyond 1 in 10 followed by 50 zeros, 1 in 10 to the 50th power, 1 in 10 followed by 50 zeros, is an event which we can state with certainty will never happen, no matter how much time is allotted and no matter how many conceivable opportunities could exist for the event to take place." So you've got a mathematician, and he gave this out as a rule of thumb. But realistically speaking, if you calculate a probability that is beyond 1 in 10 to the 50th, what he's saying is it's impossible. It's never going to happen. So the probability that all the chemicals for life arose on their own by chance, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th. 1 in 10 to the 50, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th. Well, some of the atheists and other folks will try to contend with this. They'll say, well, all non-zero probabilities are possible. And in mathematics, hypothetically, that's true. If you have a probability that you've calculated and it's not zero, then technically it's possible. I went to Thomas Robson Atheist website, and I've got a couple of quotes from this website. One quote, it says, "In reality, no such event can be rationally predicted ever to occur." And so we're talking about reality versus hypothesis or non-reality. They also stated that Borel's law of chance is of no use to us here, for it is applicable only to real-world cases. I mean, not hypothetical cases like this where we have eternity at our disposal. Let's break that down for a second. This is an atheist website speaking to this 1 in 10 to the 50th being the threshold for something being impossible, mathematically impossible. And he says that doesn't apply because, that's only real world stuff. Because in mathematics here, like what we're dealing with, we have eternity at our disposal. Question, do we really have eternity at our disposal? The universe did have a beginning. They actually calculated a date for that, so it's technically not eternity. So by their own methodology, they admit that there isn't an eternity in the natural material world. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to assume we have minds to think for ourselves. Do we want to think in the non-real, or do we want to think in reality? There was an experiment done. They call it this, it was kind of like the monkey the infinite monkey theorem, and the idea is if you put a monkey in front of a typewriter, what's the probability that the monkey can type Shakespeare's Hamlet, given an enormous amount of time, or as much time as you need, or eternity? And actually somebody did try to do that. And do you think that the monkeys put in front of the typewriter, do you think that they wrote Hamlet? No. Did they write a page? Mm-mm. Did they write a sentence? Did they write a word? I think there were a few letters more than others. I think there were some S's in there. There's no chance. See, probabilities do not speak to the reality of how a monkey functions. So no matter how many monkeys or how much time you give a monkey in front of a typewriter, they're never going to write Hamlet. It's just not going to happen. We can think this for ourselves, right? Well, what did they do? Well, they did kind of bang on it a little bit, and some of them urinated on it. To what extent would you risk your soul? 1 in 10 to the 50th power, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Well, let's say you're driving down the road, your car stalls out on top of the railroad tracks. And there's a curve, about a quarter mile, and that train's coming around the curve, a quarter mile away. What are you going to do? Well, some of you might think, well, this vehicle's light enough to push, I'm going to put in neutral, I'm going to try to get this over. Maybe you can't get in neutral if it's stalled out, maybe you're going to do something though, right? You're going to get out of the car, I assume. You want to live, you're going to get out of the car, assuming you can unbuckle and open the door and all. You're going to get out of the car. But when you say that the chance that life could have spontaneously generated itself is 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power, maybe an airplane is going to crash out of the sky and derail the train. I don't know, something's going to happen, but you're going to be all right. You can stay right in that car. What probability is your threshold for risking your soul? You might even think, I'm not even sure if I've got a soul. But am I going to take a 1 in 40,000th power, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power risk? Am I going to take that risk? If I were you, I would suggest let's look into the evidence that the soul does exist. To what extent would you risk your soul? Atheist Nobel Prize winner George Wald, he got the Nobel Prize for his research on vitamin A and color blindness. He did soften some of his views later in life, but I don't really know where he actually landed. He spoke to spontaneous generation. He said, and I quote, "One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are." Okay, so this is an atheist. I'm glad that some of these atheists are very honest people. So how are we here yet? And of course, when he made the statement, he was probably asserting that despite all the odds, somehow life spontaneously generated itself anyway. But when we jumped to that conclusion, we were ignoring an alternative. We were ignoring a logical alternative that everything natural and material was caused by something that was beyond natural, something supernatural. And the Bible tells us, Genesis 2, verse 7, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." Each and every one of us have a soul. Would we take the minuscule chance that is based on non-reality that we were spontaneously generated? No. We were designed by God. I am running out of time here. I really only had a chance to get through this one point. We still have several more evidences to consider. I'm not sure. I think I'll probably be up again in a month's time. I may be on fire. So you may not see me for a few weeks if I get called out. But please, study some of this for yourself. Look up the laws of science. Read what they say. And the fact that a law has never had an observable exception. Why would those who purport science and scientific methodology go against their own methodology when they try to explain the origin of life? It's counter-logical. And we have a perfectly logical alternative. The alternative, that's something supernatural, i.e. God himself, designed us. I want to thank you for your attention this morning as we consider what God has done for us. He is the one that gives us this soul that we can't quite put our hands on when we think about this sometimes. But the Bible clearly speaks to it. And there is ample evidence for the Bible itself, which is a separate study. So I hope you have found this encouraging. I hope that you take a step back and don't just trust everything you've heard in media, everything you've heard growing up through the education system, which continually takes God out of the picture, but to think for yourself. Look at the numbers for yourself. Think just at 30,000-foot level, basic logic for yourself. Because God gave us a mind. He gave us all minds, and we can use them rationally. Faith is based on evidence and is in harmony with science. If there is anyone that has a need, whether you wish to be baptized or wish for encouragement in prayers, I hope that you will have the courage to feel free to come forward as we stand and sing.